Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. In terms of financial disclosures in my bio, you'll read that I am now with a private corporation called Ciitizen. That's really my only financial disclosure. They pay me a salary, thankfully, so that I get to do some good work. Yeah, it helps. So I'm, in terms of talking about policy considerations, is often my role to talk about privacy considerations. I was formerly the HIPAA regulator before I went into the private sector. And I think it's always helpful to level set about why we talk about privacy. Yeah, we talk about it because it often imposes regulatory obligations on us to do certain things. But there's a reason why they exist. And it is really about trust. It's to help assure that people will, in fact, seek care. And in this context, it's about that people will be willing to enroll in clinical trials in order to generate medical discoveries that may or may not benefit the individual, but will benefit others. But even in the case of care, again, if people feel stigmatized, if people feel concerns, then they're not going to do that. And there are surveys, 1 out of 6, 1 out of 8, but if people actually saying, well, I'm going to withhold information, I'm not going to be completely truthful, I'm going to avoid participating in something like this because I have concerns about what's going to happen to that data. Mental health is an area where this comes up a lot, but it's not just in the mental health space. And in fact, building on the prior panel, racial and ethnic minorities also often are very reluctant to participate, again, in research, which we have talked about, but also in terms of the privacy issues. Who's getting this data and what's going to happen to it? Lots and lots of discussion about these issues in mainstream media, less so in the research context, but in other contexts. And all of it sort of creates an environment where, for many people, there are serious concerns. But the response to these concerns is not, well, then we can't do this. It's really about seeking ways to leverage data, because people actually do want their data to be used to help them. They want their data to be used to help others, but they want it to be done responsibly. And privacy is about enabling appropriate use. It's about good data stewardship. It is not about no. It shouldn't be about no. It should only be about no when you're trying to do something really nefarious. Then, yes, it should be about no. But when you're trying to actually advance medical science, it's really about what are the pathways to trust. How can we do this in a way that makes people comfortable with what we're doing and that we're making commitments to them about how we're using their data and we're honoring those commitments? And informed consent and honoring autonomy of the individual is an important aspect of fair information practices, but it is not absolute. It's not the only one. It's principles like transparency. Are we open with people about what we're doing? Data minimization. Are we only collecting the data that we really need in the trial? And are we minimizing who has access to it based on what's needed for the trial and for the research? I think people sometimes step over on this one. It's like, oh, well, we are not allowed to collect X and we're not allowed to collect Y. But the truth is that the purpose for which you're doing the research should then dictate what data elements do we really need to collect and who really needs to see this. Safeguards around that. Security is actually about how do we use technology and protocols and policies in order to honor, again, our privacy commitments that we're making to people. And how do we hold ourselves accountable for all of this? That's really what privacy is all about. So we've talked a lot about how we don't quite know what to call virtual clinical trials, trials 2.0, innovative trials. Leanne just introduced yet another term that we could use, notwithstanding that the term innovative is really pretty overused these days. But nevertheless, you won't find any of these definitions in HIPAA, which is not the only source of regulation of privacy, but is a big one that is out there. Instead, what we have are definitions of research. Clearly, what we're doing here is research. And there is a definition of what constitutes research in HIPAA, and it's the same one that's used in the Common Rule. If you're contributing to generalizable knowledge in some sort of systematic way, you are in the research field and subject to research regulation. So when does HIPAA apply in the context of a virtual, decentralized, innovative 2.0 clinical trial? And I think that's a little bit of an open question. Certainly if you are a HIPAA-covered entity, and unless you've done what's called hybridization and sort of moved your research functions off to the side and said they're not covered by HIPAA, then the data that you are collecting as part of a trial is going to be covered by HIPAA, even if that data is submitted to you, say, from a patient's mobile device. Once it gets to you and is within your responsibility to protect, it's going to be HIPAA covered. And then, of course, if you are a covered entity and you're contributing to data to a clinical trial, you've got to make sure that you're covered in terms of your disclosures of that data. I think it gets actually a little bit trickier when you do think about some of these trials that are being conducted in external settings, where maybe the data might ultimately come into a covered entity for analysis where it's covered, but is it also collected like on the phone that the patient has? And the answer to that is actually it depends. And I know you guys hate that answer, but it's the reality. And it's really a test of how much are you controlling the environment in the virtual setting, in the decentralized setting, versus within your own setting once the data comes in your door. Now there's a couple of links here to some guidance that OCR put out actually when I was there about, when are you a business associate and interacting with consumers on devices, and just merely creating the interface, what they called an interoperability arrangement, which is, I'll go down in infamy on that one. Nobody knew what it was. We're sorry. We meant the connection, okay? If all you're doing is creating the connection that enables the data to come in, doesn't necessarily make the device manufacturer, or really never the patient, your business associate. But I could see a scenario, and in thinking about how the presentation that Leonard just gave about, you need investigators, you need some sort of oversight over the trial, and then if you're giving patients the mobile device that they're supposed to use, for example, in order to submit the data, there are going to be instances where you're going to potentially be held responsible, again, if you are covered by HIPAA in the first place, for what's going on in the remote activities of the trial, depending on how much control you have. And it's really going to depend on the circumstances. Now, keep in mind that the Federal Trade Commission, this is not just HIPAA, although I put it on a HIPAA slide, probably poor planning on my part. HIPAA also has the authority to police what are unfair and deceptive trade practices of commercial entities. So in fact, even if the patient is using a commercial device and you've made the determination you're not in control of it and it's not covered by HIPAA, there may still be some liability on the part of the vendor of the app that the patient is using, or the device itself, with respect to protecting that data that the FTC would hold them accountable for. I think this is a crowd that probably doesn't really need this slide. Once you're in the world of HIPAA and you're in research and you've sort of defined sort of the scope of what you're responsible for, how does HIPAA govern research uses of data? Well, there's pretty heavy reliance outside really of the clinical trial context on de-identification or anonymization of data. That's in the context that we're talking about here, that's more of a data reuse issue, not a sort of primary collection issue. We're really dealing in the space where you're going to be seeking consent from individuals in order to get this data. And both HIPAA and the Common Rule have provided for more generalized consents for future research uses, but certainly in the context of a particular trial, you need that consent to both meet FDA and Common Rule requirements, and maybe potentially HIPAA, although now with Common Rule changes, you might be able to choose your venue. But they're all fairly similar with respect to the expectations on consent. I think my overarching conclusion on this slide is that there are paths forward. There are paths forward, and people do this. I get very, very frustrated when people find out what I do for a living and they say, oh, our privacy office is terrible. They won't let us do anything. They place all sorts of obstacles. I was really persuaded by, or actually depressed is probably the better way to put it, with Stephen Cummings' slides from yesterday about just how expensive and laden with process and documents and checkboxes that it all got for a trial that was intended to be very simple, and then compliance lawyers got a hold of it and dressed it up with all sorts of things that made it really, really hard. This is not the law. This is risk aversion. This is risk aversion. When things are uncertain, when I say it depends, when Leonard puts a set of slides up and say, well, it's contextual, and what's actually happening, and where are you collecting the data, and what type of data are you collecting, and how much monitoring do you need to do, it makes risk-averse people very nervous, and that's their job. Their job is to keep their companies out of jail, and their job is ideally to make sure things go forward. But too often, when guidance is missing, and whether that's guidance from regulators, which is great when you can get it, but even guidance from your peers and other people in the space, when that is missing, it's really hard for you to climb out on that limb and say, well, I don't think anybody else is doing this, but yeah, let's go do this. That makes it harder. The more that we can do to socialize what is actually happening, even down to the incremental level of how did this happen from a process standpoint? How did the lawyers get to yes? Is really, really helpful. Let's do more of that. So I want to also talk a little bit about some privacy law trends, because we know HIPAA, and those of us who are super sophisticated in this space now know the Global Data Protection Rule, which applies when you are collecting data from patients in the European Union. So it's not just to entities located in Europe. We'll talk about that in a second. But there was also some sweeping privacy legislation that was enacted in California. The trend overall to these new privacy laws is to require more explicit consent in more circumstances. That's, again, not necessarily as big of a concern for this particular use case, because we're talking about a clinical trial where consent is the expectation and the norm, both from an ethical and a legal standpoint. There's also setting a higher bar for data to be considered to be de-identified. Again, less of a concern with the primary data collection in a clinical trial, but certainly a concern for later data sharing for replication of results, for example, or for additional studies after the fact. Again, GDPR, if you're sitting there thinking, and I know none of the pharma companies out there are thinking this, but if you're sitting there thinking, well, I'm not located in Europe, so I don't have to worry about this, that is not the right way to approach this. If you are collecting information or monitoring the behavior of data subjects within the European Union, you're in. And this is a law that's already in effect. It applies to personal data, and it's broadly applicable. This is not the world of HIPAA where it only applies to some entities and not others. If you've got personal data and you're either a controller or a processor, and you got to figure out which one you are, and then figure out how you need to protect this data. Generally, consent required to use personal data. There is an allowance for scientific research, but subject to safeguards. You need to look more at the guidance about this. We don't have enough time to go into that in a lot of detail. Here is the definition of personal data. Again, it's pretty broad, and also pretty broad with respect to the issue of whether it's identifiable or not. The California Consumer Protection Act does not go into effect until January 1st in 2020, but it does have some retroactive or some applications that if you haven't already started to get into compliance in 2019, you're going to have a hard time demonstrating compliance on January 1 of 2020. It sets up a relatively high bar for the types of businesses that are covered by it. They need to be large, is the basic qualification. But it's not just entities located in California, but if you're collecting a lot of data from California consumers, 1/6 of the US population, I think is the estimate there, you could be swept into this. The personal information definition is 2 slides long with very small font. So as you can see, the trend here is to really be very, very broad and about the type of, and inclusive about the type of data that's going to be covered. Also, their definition of de-identified is incredibly strict, and the general conclusion of folks who have been trying to analyze this law and figure out what to do to be in compliance with it is that this is much stricter set of expectations in terms of when data are considered to be de-identified. Now, I really apologize that this slide has tiny, tiny font. Slides will be available for folks, but there's a whole list of exceptions for entities in the healthcare space, including, and C is really the most important one for this gathering, which is information collected as part of a clinical trial that is either going to be subject to the common rule or to FDA rules or to the good clinical practice guidelines issued by the International Council for Harmonization. So they have been persuaded in California that this space is pretty well regulated and we don't necessarily have to cover it with the CCPA. But I raise this for you because that's just a clinical trial exception. Applies really well here. Doesn't apply to lots and lots of other research. So subsequent uses of data covered by a clinical trial may or may not, will not be subject to that exception and may or may not be subject to some of the other exceptions, depending on other, an analysis of whether you're covered by HIPAA or you're covered by other rules in the state of California. So the thing I'll say in closing is that this is not the end of the story. Privacy is a hot topic, and Congress is actively talking about whether they should get back into this space in a bigger way. So stay tuned. I'm looking forward to the discussion, and thank you again for the opportunity.